Good evening, night owls, and welcome back to Sleepless Politics, the place where history is stranger than fiction, coffee is mandatory, and the stories we uncover make you question whether truth is just a more bizarre kind of lie. Tonight, we're leaving the shadowy corridors of espionage and injustice and heading straight into the dust, the outback, and an unlikely battlefield where humans and birds collided in a way so absurd it almost defies belief. This is the story of the Great Emu War of 1932, a military campaign waged not against a foreign enemy, but against one of nature's most resilient, flightless birds. And yes, it was an actual war. It all began in Western Australia, during a time of economic hardship. The Great Depression had gripped the country. Farmers were struggling, wheat prices had plummeted, banks were foreclosing on properties, and just when life seemed difficult enough, a new problem arrived from the sky. Well, not exactly the sky, but certainly from the horizon: emus. Emus are enormous, fast-running birds, taller than most men, capable of sprinting at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. Normally, they keep to themselves, wandering the arid interior in search of food and water. But in 1932, tens of thousands of these giant birds migrated to the wheat-growing regions of Western Australia. And what they found there was nothing short of paradise. Lush fields of young wheat, irrigation channels, and a landscape humans had meticulously prepared for agriculture. To the farmers, the emus were no longer a curiosity of nature. They were a catastrophe. By November of that year, the situation had escalated. Farmers reported entire crops being destroyed overnight, fences being flattened, and stockyards being invaded. Emus moved in organized groups, almost like an army in formation, stripping the land of sustenance with relentless efficiency. Farmers tried everything: chasing them, scaring them off, erecting barriers, even shooting. But the birds seemed impervious to conventional methods. Reports of destroyed fences and trampling were flooding newspapers, and public outrage grew. The government, desperate to support struggling farmers and assert some control over the situation, decided to act. But this was no ordinary pest control. Oh no, it was officially a military operation. Soldiers were dispatched, armed with Lewis machine guns and a modest supply of ammunition, with orders to reduce the emu population and protect the wheat harvest. Imagine, if you will, armed men in khaki uniforms standing in the dry, hot dust of the Australian outback preparing to fight birds. Not lions, not enemy soldiers, not tanks or cavalry. Birds. The first encounters were chaotic. Emus, despite their size, were agile and surprisingly intelligent. They scattered at the approach of soldiers, ducking, weaving, and sprinting in unpredictable patterns. The machine guns jammed under the harsh conditions of sand and heat. Soldiers found themselves exhausted, sweating, and increasingly frustrated. One official report described the emus as an army of destructive, agile, and unusually evasive targets, a statement that perfectly captured the absurdity of the conflict. News of the campaign spread quickly. The press, delighted by the combination of human hubris and avian cunning, covered it extensively. Headlines ranged from mockery to incredulity. Emus outwit army, machine guns ineffective against birds, and farmers continue to lose battle to feathered foe. Letters poured in from curious citizens, both in Australia and abroad, asking incredulously if this was really a war, and if so, who was winning. By the end of the first week of engagement, the soldiers were exhausted, the ammunition was dwindling, and the emus remained largely unscathed. The so-called war, intended to be decisive, had turned into a military embarrassment. Birds that were supposed to be pests were now perceived almost as clever adversaries. And behind it all was a larger truth. Nature does not play by human rules. Strategies, plans, and firepower that worked against human opponents or even conventional threats had no effect on the emus, who were simply doing what emus do best: surviving, feeding, and moving in massive, coordinated flocks. The first battle ended with inconclusive results, and the soldiers retreated temporarily, regrouping and reconsidering their tactics. They tried again with different strategies, including ambushes and higher rates of fire, but the birds continued to evade them. Stories emerged of emus running through lines of fire, surviving shots, and scattering in ways that no human could anticipate. Farmers watched helplessly, knowing that every field still vulnerable to the emus represented food lost, money lost, and hope slipping away. And so the stage was set for one of the most bizarre military campaigns in history, a war where the enemy could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or even reliably killed despite superior firepower. It was the war where humans faced the absurd truth. Sometimes nature fights back, and sometimes it wins.
If you thought the first clash with the emus was strange, strap in, because what followed was even more absurd, more chaotic, and more emblematic of what happens when human pride meets the stubbornness of nature. After the inconclusive first battle, the military decided to regroup. They believed that with better planning, improved tactics, and sheer firepower, the emus could be subdued. Soldiers returned to the fields armed again with Lewis machine guns, trucks, and fresh ammunition. The farmers watched with a mix of hope and disbelief, their livelihoods hanging on the line while the birds, completely indifferent to human concerns, continued to feast. The emus had no central command, no hierarchy, and yet they moved with the precision of a well-coordinated force. Their flocks spread out, feeding by day and retreating by night, almost as if they had learned from the first encounter. Soldiers tried to chase them down in trucks, setting up ambushes and firing from mounted positions, but the emus were fast, unpredictable, and surprisingly intelligent. Reports emerged of bullets failing to hit their mark, of birds scattering at the first sound of gunfire, and even of soldiers becoming dizzy and frustrated by the sheer chaos. One official report dryly noted that the birds appeared almost to anticipate the army's movements, turning what should have been a decisive engagement into a humiliating spectacle. Newspapers and photographers descended on the scene. Headlines brimmed with mockery, and cartoonists had a field day depicting soldiers overwhelmed by giant, fast-running birds. The press, sensing the surreal and almost comedic angle of the story, amplified it worldwide. Letters poured in from curious citizens, some sympathetic, some incredulous. Night thinkers like us, reading these accounts decades later, can't help but marvel at the sheer absurdity. Imagine the scene. Disciplined soldiers, trained for combat, outmaneuvered by flightless birds on open farmland. The emus had turned the human concept of war on its head. Even the soldiers themselves could not hide their frustration. Ammunition ran low, morale dropped, and the heat of the Australian outback compounded exhaustion. Efforts to herd or corral the emus failed. Attempts at machine gun ambushes proved ineffective, as the birds split into multiple groups or simply outran the gunfire. By the end of the second engagement, the military had achieved minimal success. A handful of birds downed, but tens of thousands still thriving. The emus were largely unscathed, and the fields remained devastated. At this point, the public reaction became part of the story itself. Readers across Australia and even overseas were stunned. Was this really happening? How could trained soldiers lose a war against birds? Farmers, exhausted by the continual destruction, expressed both relief and exasperation. Relief that the government was finally taking action, exasperation that the action was spectacularly ineffective. And so the story of the Great Emu War became not just a tale of agriculture and wildlife, but a narrative about human hubris, miscalculation, and the unpredictable power of nature. But here's the part I want to slow down on: the social aspect. Communities began sharing stories of emus evading soldiers, destroying crops, and seemingly laughing in the face of technology. Families debated the bird's cleverness at dinner tables. Children drew cartoons of emu generals outsmarting humans. The war was becoming folklore in real time, a blend of tragedy, comedy, and history. And in every account, you could feel the subtle lesson. Sometimes the natural world does not bend to human will. It survives, adapts, and endures. By the end of the second campaign, the soldiers had retreated once more. The official statement was that the emus were too agile, too scattered, and too numerous to control effectively. The farmers were still in crisis. The wheat continued to be consumed, and the emus, oblivious to the chaos they had caused, continued migrating through the fields with relentless efficiency. Humanity, it seemed, had lost, and nature had the last laugh. And now, Night Thinkers, here's where you come in. I want you to drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what you think about this story. Can you believe that trained soldiers lost a war against birds? Do you find it hilarious, frustrating, or strangely inspiring? Sharing your thoughts helps map the world's sleepless minds and keeps this bizarre story alive beyond history books. Because the Great Emu War isn't just a historical footnote, it's a lesson in humility, resilience, and the absurdities that emerge when humans try to control the natural world. And as we continue, we'll explore how the military's final efforts fared, how the emus maintained their dominance, and what lessons remain relevant even today.
As 1932 dragged on, the military and the farmers both realized that the emus were not just a temporary nuisance. They were, in essence, an unstoppable force of nature. The soldiers returned for a third campaign, armed once again with Lewis guns and fresh ammunition, but their confidence had waned. Where they had once imagined a decisive victory, they now faced the humiliating reality that the birds were smarter, faster, and more adaptable than anticipated. Strategies were planned meticulously. Officers coordinated ambushes along watering holes, set up observation points, and even attempted to herd the emus into confined areas. But every attempt ended in chaos. The birds scattered in unpredictable directions, often running at speeds that made machine gun targeting nearly impossible. Farmers watched from the sidelines with a mix of hope and exasperation. Each loss of wheat, each trampled defense, and each failed military maneuver deepened their despair. Some considered abandoning the fields entirely, resigned to the emu's dominance. Others began to laugh at the absurdity of it all, realizing that the war had become less about agriculture and more about human pride. Soldiers reported exhaustion, frustration, and a strange sense of defeat against creatures that seemed almost invincible. And indeed, the emus were invincible in their simplicity. Eat, move, survive. No ideology, no strategy, just instinct perfected over millennia. The press had a field day. International coverage of the Great Emu War painted a picture of human folly. Headlines mocked the military, described the birds as feathered generals, and detailed the chaotic campaigns with almost comedic flair. Photographs captured soldiers firing into the dust that birds that had already sprinted beyond their reach. Cartoons depicted emus laughing and evading bullets, while exhausted soldiers slumped in defeat. In a way, the world was watching a surreal theater of war unfold in real time, blending elements of tragedy, comedy, and sheer disbelief. Yet beneath the humor, there was a serious lesson. The emus were not malicious. They were following natural instincts, responding to environmental cues, and seeking sustenance in a human-altered landscape. The human response, military intervention, machine guns, and strategic planning was disproportionate to the challenge and in some ways fundamentally misguided. Historians today note that the Great Emu War was as much a story of human arrogance as it was about avian resilience. It exposed the limits of human control, the hubris of believing that nature could be subdued with technology alone, and the consequences of failing to understand ecological dynamics. The final military campaign achieved minimal success. Reports suggested that only a few hundred birds were killed, almost a negligible fraction compared to the tens of thousands wreaking havoc on the wheat fields. By December 1932, the military officially withdrew, citing logistical difficulties and the futility of further action. Farmers had to adapt. Some turned to building exclusion fences, others experimented with deterrence, and many simply accepted that coexisting with the emus was now part of rural life in Western Australia. The so-called war ended not with victory, but with a reluctant truce. Humans acknowledged that the emus were too numerous, too fast, and too clever to be eradicated by force. And so the Great Emu War entered history as a bizarre footnote, often cited for its comedic absurdity, but also remembered for its deeper lessons. Nature does not conform to human expectations. Technology and strategy are no match for instinct and adaptability. Even small creatures, underestimated by humans, can triumph when we fail to respect their capabilities. The emus, oblivious to the headlines and human commentary, continued to roam and feed, as they had long before the war began and as they do to this day. With the military withdrawn and the emus largely unscathed, life in Western Australia settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. Farmers faced the sobering reality that the birds were here to stay, and no amount of firepower could fully remove them from the landscape. Some built sturdier fences, experimented with scare tactics, or relocated crops, but the underlying truth remained. Humans could not fully control nature, no matter how advanced their tools or how serious their intentions. The emus, meanwhile, continued their relentless march, grazing through wheat fields and marshes alike, unconcerned by the chaos they had caused. Their silent persistence became a symbol, a living reminder that life has its own agenda, one that rarely bends to human will. The Great Emu War, as it came to be known, captured the imagination of Australians and the world alike. Newspapers chronicled the battles in detail, often blending factual reporting with humor. Political cartoons became particularly popular, depicting soldiers crouched behind dust clouds, machine guns aimed at the ever-elusive birds. Emus were portrayed with anthropomorphic cleverness, generals in feathers, masters of tactics, laughing at the humans who believed they could dominate them. These representations blurred the line between reality and satire, cementing the event in public memory as both a historical moment and a comical legend. Beyond entertainment, the Emu War had serious implications for policy and agricultural practices. The government recognized that simply deploying the military against wildlife was both ineffective and costly. Future responses to natural pests required more sustainable approaches, including fencing programs, bounty systems, and ecological management strategies. Farmers began to learn that coexistence, combined with smart planning, was far more effective than brute force. In this sense, the Emu War became a turning point in agricultural strategy, forcing policymakers to balance human needs with ecological realities. Culturally, the emus assumed a near mythical status. Stories of the war were passed down through generations, blending fact with legend. Children learned of the birds that had defeated the army, and families recounted tales of soldiers ambushed by flocks of impossibly fast birds. Writers, historians, and comedians alike drew inspiration from the episode. The Emu War became a touchstone for discussions about human hubris, the unpredictability of nature, and the limits of technological power when confronted by instinct and adaptability. It was celebrated not just as a funny anecdote, but as a cautionary tale about respect for the natural world. Even internationally, the story resonated. Foreign journalists reported on the absurdity of trained soldiers losing to flightless birds, highlighting the narrative as emblematic of the unexpected challenges that arise when humans underestimate the natural environment. The Great Emu War became a favorite in history books, trivia collections, and lectures about environmental management, demonstrating that lessons about humility and adaptation can come from the most unusual circumstances. For the farmers themselves, life continued under the long shadow of the emus. Wheat fields were replanted, fences reinforced, and crop management improved. While emus continued to be a presence, farmers learned to mitigate losses through careful planning and by understanding the birds' behavior. Over time, these strategies became standard practice, and the memory of machine guns firing at fleeing emus evolved into a story of resilience, both human and avian. The legacy of the Emu War also underscores a broader lesson that remains relevant today. It reminds us that human ingenuity and power are not always sufficient to dominate or reshape the natural world. Environmental challenges, whether large or small, often require respect, patience, and adaptation rather than brute force. In confronting the emus, humans were reminded of their place in the ecosystem, not as absolute rulers, but as participants in a complex and unpredictable web of life. And so, the Great Emu War remains a story of absurdity, resilience, and humility. It is a tale where humans sought to impose order, yet nature had its own plan. It is remembered for its humor, but also for its lessons about strategy, persistence, and the unexpected intelligence of creatures humans might otherwise dismiss. In the end, the emus walked away victorious, and humanity was left to reflect, adapt, and perhaps just a little, laugh at its own overconfidence.
The Great Emu War, though brief and often recounted with humor, left an enduring mark on Australian society and beyond. What began as a desperate military response to crop destruction evolved into a cautionary tale about the limits of human control, the resilience of nature, and the dangers of underestimating even the most unassuming adversaries. In retrospect, it was a conflict that highlighted the absurdity of hubris while simultaneously demonstrating the importance of adaptation, planning, and respect for ecological systems. For policymakers, the Emu War served as a lesson in pragmatic management. The realization that military intervention was ineffective led to the development of more sustainable solutions to wildlife and agricultural challenges. Fence lines were reinforced with careful attention to emu behavior. Farmers began rotating crops and creating buffer zones to reduce the impact of flocks migrating through wheat-growing areas. Bounties and other deterrents were introduced, but always with an awareness that emus were not enemies in a conventional sense. They were creatures following instinct. The war illustrated that human ingenuity, when applied without an understanding of the natural world, can often result in waste, frustration, or outright failure. Culturally, the conflict entered Australian folklore almost immediately. Stories of soldiers chasing birds that could run faster than trucks became legendary. Generations of Australians grew up hearing about the army that lost to emus, and the tale became a source of national amusement. Yet, beneath the humor, the story carried lessons about humility and perseverance. It reminded citizens that intelligence, technology, and planning have limits,
when confronted with forces beyond our full comprehension, and that respect for the environment is not optional but necessary. Historians and environmentalists have since revisited the Emu War with renewed interest. While it is frequently cited in lists of absurd historical events, the story also illuminates the intersection of human economic activity, wildlife behavior, and government intervention. It demonstrates that attempts to impose control without understanding the ecosystem often backfire. In modern terms, the Emu War foreshadowed many challenges faced by humanity today, from pest management to climate change. It is a vivid example of how arrogance and ignorance can exacerbate natural problems rather than solve them. The emus themselves remain a symbol of resilience and adaptation. Tens of thousands still roam the outback, thriving despite human encroachment and agricultural expansion. They are not simply birds. They are living reminders of a historical event where instinct and survival prevailed over human technology and authority. The Great Emu War, in this sense, has become a moral as well as a historical lesson. No matter how advanced humans become, nature's adaptability cannot be underestimated. On a global scale, the story has fascinated audiences for decades. International journalists, comedians, and educators have referenced the war to illustrate lessons in strategy, humility, and problem solving. Military academies sometimes recount it as a quirky case study in planning versus unpredictability. Environmentalists use it to demonstrate the importance of coexisting with wildlife rather than seeking to eradicate it with force. And for the general public, it remains a story that entertains, while simultaneously teaching deeper truths about human limitations. The Great Emu War also highlights the role of narrative in shaping historical memory. Newspapers, cartoons, and personal accounts ensured that the war would not be forgotten. Its combination of tragedy and comedy, human error and natural cunning, has ensured that it remains a compelling story across generations. The legend of the emus outsmarting the army endures because it taps into something universal: the tension between ambition and humility, between human desire for control and the unpredictable forces of the world. Ultimately, the Emu War is more than an amusing historical anecdote. It is a reminder that human pride can be humbled by persistence, by resilience, and by the simplest creatures. It is a testament to the unexpected lessons hidden in the natural world, and a story that continues to resonate because it defies expectation, challenges assumptions, and rewards those who pay attention. For Australia, it remains a defining moment of absurdity and insight, a war that the emus, in their quiet, relentless way, clearly won.
Looking back, the Great Emu War is remarkable not simply for its absurdity, but for the lessons it imparts about human ambition, resilience, and the unpredictability of the natural world. At first glance, it seems like a story of failure. Trained soldiers outmaneuvered by birds, fields decimated despite superior firepower, and government intervention proving largely ineffective. Yet, beneath the surface lies a far richer tale, one about adaptation, humility, and the limits of brute force. It reminds us that nature operates according to its own rules, often imperceptible to human understanding, and that persistence, instinct, and simplicity can outmatch technological superiority. For the farmers of Western Australia, the Emu War was a harsh teacher. They had learned that fighting nature head-on often leads to frustration and loss, and that ingenuity, observation, and coexistence are far more effective than confrontation. Fences were redesigned to account for the birds' habits. Crop placement was reconsidered to create natural barriers. Communities worked together to mitigate losses without resorting to feudal military measures. In these adjustments, one sees the real victory of the emus. They forced humans to think differently, to respect the environment, and to recognize the limitations of human intervention. Culturally, the emus became legends,
creatures that, almost comically, outsmarted a human army. They came to embody resilience and intelligence, reminding Australians that survival does not always require strength or cunning in the way humans define it. Stories of emus fleeing machine guns, scattering into the bush, and emerging unscathed became folklore, carried from generation to generation, a tale retold with laughter, awe, and a tinge of disbelief. The Great Emu War transcended its literal events, evolving into a narrative about the unpredictability of life and the hubris of assuming we can control every challenge we face. Historians have reflected on the war as an object lesson in the folly of overconfidence. The military, confident in its training, weaponry, and hierarchical planning, underestimated the adaptability and speed of the emus. This miscalculation resonates beyond 1932. It reminds us that no amount of technology or authority guarantees success against forces we do not fully understand, whether those forces are ecological, social, or even psychological. The absurdity of soldiers retreating from birds underscores a universal truth. Respect for complexity, unpredictability, and resilience is essential, whether in warfare, governance, or life itself. From an ecological perspective, the war demonstrated the challenges of human-wildlife conflict. Attempting to eliminate a natural species through direct confrontation rarely produces lasting results. Sustainable approaches, observation, adaptation, and respect are far more effective. Modern environmental management echoes this lesson, highlighting the importance of coexistence and strategic planning rather than domination. The emus unconsciously became teachers of these principles, their presence forcing humans to confront the limits of control. Even internationally, the Great Emu War is remembered as a story that straddles humor and wisdom. Military strategists, environmentalists, and historians alike reference it as a cautionary tale. It is cited in books, lectures, and discussions as an example of how even the simplest adversary can defeat a seemingly superior force. The war has entered the popular imagination not only as a quirky anecdote, but as a metaphor for human miscalculation, the unpredictability of life, and the enduring power of resilience. In the end, the Great Emu War is far more than a historical oddity. It is a narrative of humility, a reminder that nature cannot be bullied into submission, and that ingenuity, patience, and observation often achieve what force cannot. The emus, unconcerned with human politics, strategy, or pride, achieved what armies could not. Their quiet persistence reshaped the landscape, the policies, and the imagination of those who bore witness. As history remembers this bizarre conflict, one truth stands clear. Sometimes the victors of war are not measured in casualties or territory, but in the enduring lessons they leave behind. And in the case of the Great Emu War, those lessons belong to the emus. They taught humans about respect, adaptation, and humility, lessons that resonate as much today as they did in the dusty wheat fields of Western Australia nearly a century ago.
And so, the story of the Great Emu War draws to a close, not with the roar of victory or the formal signing of treaties, but with a quiet, enduring truth. Nature does not bend to human will. The soldiers returned home, the farmers rebuilt their fences, and the emus continued to roam the plains, oblivious to the chaos they had caused. History often remembers wars in terms of strategy, casualties, and conquests. But this war was different. The victors were not human, the battles were unconventional, and the lessons were profound. The absurdity of soldiers retreating from birds has made the Emu War a source of humor, but beneath the laughter lies a mirror for human pride and ambition. It reminds us that intelligence, planning, and firepower are not always enough. Sometimes survival, persistence, and instinct prevail in ways humans cannot anticipate. The emus, in their relentless, quiet way, became symbols of resilience and adaptability. They forced an entire community, a nation even, to reconsider the limits of control and the necessity of respect for the natural world. For Western Australia's farmers, the lessons were tangible. Fences were redesigned, crops were relocated, and new approaches to pest management were developed. Humans learned to coexist rather than confront, to anticipate rather than dominate. And for the soldiers, the Great Emu War became a humbling chapter in military history, a reminder that not all campaigns are won through strength or strategy alone. Sometimes the greatest adversaries are the ones we failed to respect or understand. Globally, the story has endured because it blends absurdity with wisdom. It has been retold in books, lectures, and media outlets, inspiring laughter and reflection in equal measure. The Emu War challenges us to question assumptions about power, control, and human superiority. It demonstrates that even the most unassuming opponents, in this case, flightless birds, can outmaneuver the seemingly powerful when conditions favor adaptability, instinct, and endurance. And as we close this chapter, Night Thinkers, the lesson remains clear. Humility matters. Observation, patience, and respect for forces beyond our control are often more effective than brute force. The Great Emu War is more than a historical anecdote. It is a story of resilience, a mirror reflecting the limits of human ambition, and a reminder that sometimes the natural world wins, quietly and unassumingly against all expectations. So here's the final thought to take with you into the night. The emus did not fight out of malice, nor did they strategize with malice in mind. They simply existed, and in doing so, they outlasted a human army. And perhaps, in that simple truth, there is a lesson for all of us. Respect the world around you, adapt when necessary, and never underestimate the quiet power of persistence, no matter how small or feathered it may be.
Even after the military withdrew, the war's aftermath remained painfully visible across Western Australia. Farmers awoke to flattened wheat fields, trampled fences, and countless emu tracks slicing through the dust. Every morning brought fresh challenges. The emu seemed to arrive in larger numbers than the day before, their migration patterns shifting unpredictably with the seasons. For the men and women working the land, this was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to survival. Wheat was not merely a crop, it was food, income, and hope for families struggling under the shadow of the Great Depression. The emu's relentless grazing threatened both livelihood and morale, and farmers were forced to confront the limits of human ingenuity without military support. The farmers' response was both practical and inventive. Fences were reinforced with wire mesh and wooden stakes, sometimes stretching for kilometers to keep the birds out. Some built double-layered barriers to prevent flocks from simply pushing through weak points. Farmers also experimented with noise deterrents, banging metal sheets, firing shotguns in warning bursts, and even attempting to scare the birds with trained dogs. In some areas, farmers tried to herd the emus toward natural obstacles like swamps or riverbeds, hoping to slow them down. Yet, the emus proved remarkably adaptable. They would wait, watching silently, then scatter at the slightest human movement, leaving behind a path of destruction that seemed almost orchestrated. Daily life for these farmers became a battle of attention, timing, and observation. Some rose before dawn to check fences and chase flocks away before they reached the crops. Others walked miles between fields, trying to anticipate the birds' movements. Families pitched in, with children collecting fallen stalks and repairing fences, while older men set up temporary posts and scarecrows. These efforts were exhausting, but necessary, any lapse in vigilance could result in hundreds of pounds of wheat lost overnight. The psychological toll was enormous. Frustration, helplessness, and a sense of inevitability settled over the communities. The emus unknowingly had become agents of stress, testing not only physical endurance, but mental resilience. Yet, amidst the struggle, a sense of ingenuity and community flourished. Farmers began sharing strategies, creating informal networks of information about flock movements and effective deterrence. Reports circulated about particular birds that seemed unusually bold or clever, leading to a folklore of leader emus that coordinated attacks on farms. While this may have been exaggeration, it reflected the way communities coped, through humor, storytelling, and a sense of camaraderie in the face of adversity. The emus, unintentionally, had become central figures in rural culture, their presence shaping the rhythms, conversations, and daily routines of human communities. The media also played a role in amplifying the farmer struggle. Newspapers published letters and stories from farmers detailing encounters with the emus, creating a sense of urgency and often hilarity. International audiences marveled at the idea that humans, with machine guns and trucks at their disposal, had failed to subdue birds. In Australia, the coverage was both sympathetic and tongue-in-cheek. Editorial cartoons showed emus outsmarting soldiers, tractors being toppled, and farmers resigning themselves to a feathered dominion over their land. This duality, tragedy and comedy intertwined, reinforced the narrative of the emus as a force beyond human control, capable of challenging not just crops, but pride itself. Economically, the impact was measurable. Some farmers lost significant portions of their wheat harvest, affecting income for the year and sometimes forcing families into debt. Others diversified crops, planting less vulnerable grains or creating buffer zones to slow the emu's approach. Agricultural boards studied the problem, commissioning reports and consulting wildlife experts. Solutions ranged from fencing innovations to population control through limited hunting, but all acknowledged a central truth. The emus could not be eliminated entirely. They were too numerous, too agile, and too adept at survival to be eradicated. In the long view, the farmer struggle highlighted human limitations and adaptability. While the military's approach relied on firepower, the daily reality required patience, observation, and clever management. These adaptations laid the groundwork for more sophisticated pest management systems in Australia, combining ecological knowledge with practical agricultural planning. What seemed at first like a comedic failure became, in hindsight, a powerful lesson in resilience, both for the farmers and for the nation as a whole. While humans scrambled to devise strategies to protect crops, the emus continued to navigate the outback with an almost uncanny efficiency. What made them so successful in this war was not sheer size or speed alone, but a combination of behavioral adaptations honed over millennia. These birds, though flightless, were expert foragers, adept at moving across vast distances in search of food and water. Their social structure allowed them to travel in loosely coordinated flocks, which, while not centralized, exhibited collective awareness that proved extraordinarily effective against human interference. Emus relied on an intricate combination of sight, hearing, and instinctual intelligence. They could spot distant threats, whether humans, trucks, or gunfire, from hundreds of meters away, giving them ample time to scatter. Their running behavior was adaptive. They would change direction unpredictably, sometimes halting only momentarily before sprinting in a new trajectory, confounding soldiers' attempts to target them. Machine guns, which might have devastated stationary or predictable targets, were nearly useless against this combination of speed, agility, and split-second decision-making. The birds' movements were not random. They were calculated survival tactics, albeit instinctual rather than conscious. Flock dynamics played a key role in their survival. While there was no hierarchical command, the birds often moved in formations that allowed for efficient feeding and rapid dispersal. If one group encountered danger, the scattering behavior would ripple through the flock, making the whole unit difficult to target. This collective adaptation resembled a natural form of crowd intelligence. The group's survival depended on decentralized coordination, a concept that modern scientists would later recognize as an evolutionary advantage. The emu's strategy was simple but effective: avoid danger, find food, and continue moving. Humans, with their rigid military protocols, struggled to counter a force that operated without rigid structure. The emu's diet and migratory patterns further reinforced their advantage. Western Australia's wheat fields provided an abundant, concentrated food source, drawing birds from hundreds of kilometers away. Unlike humans, emus did not require shelter or preparation. They could survive on seeds, grains, and water in minimal amounts, moving only as needed to maximize resources. Their migrations were synchronized with seasonal cycles, ensuring that the birds appeared in areas just when crops were most vulnerable. Humans, in contrast, were forced to anticipate these migrations, often with limited information and insufficient manpower. This mismatch of timing and adaptation gave the emus a decisive advantage. Even environmental factors favored the birds. The harsh Australian outback, scorching days, dusty winds, and vast open plains made sustained military operations extremely difficult. Soldiers became fatigued, trucks broke down, and equipment failed under the conditions. Emus, evolved to thrive in this environment, moved effortlessly. They required no rest, no complex logistics, and no artificial support. In essence, the battlefield itself was designed in their favor, turning human technology into a liability rather than an advantage. Observers at the time noted the birds' apparent cleverness, describing them as almost mocking the humans. While clearly anthropomorphizing, these accounts reflected the striking contrast between human expectations and the emu's unpredictable behavior. Each failed ambush, every missed shot, and every trampled fence reinforced the idea that the birds had outwitted a superior armed opponent. The emu's success was a combination of instinct, environmental adaptation, and sheer numbers, a reminder that survival often depends not on intelligence in the human sense, but on harmony with one's environment and the ability to respond to threats fluidly. In hindsight, the emu's behavioral intelligence can be seen as a masterclass in ecological adaptation. They thrived in a landscape that humans had altered for agriculture, exploiting resources without succumbing to traps or threats. The war may have been fought with bullets and trucks, but the real victor was the species that had evolved to survive in the Australian interior over thousands of years. The emu's triumph was silent, relentless, and ultimately decisive, a lesson in resilience, patience, and the power of natural adaptation. Even today, ecologists reference the Great Emu War as a case study in animal behavior, population management, and human-wildlife conflict. The bird's ability to survive against overwhelming odds, not through malice or planning, but through instinctual adaptation, remains a fascinating example of evolutionary advantage and environmental mastery. Humans, despite firepower, training, and determination, had underestimated the subtle intelligence of nature, and the emus proved that survival often favors those who adapt most effectively. As news of the military's repeated failures against the emus reached the wider public, the story quickly took on a life of its own. Newspapers across Australia were filled with vivid accounts of soldiers chasing flocks of flightless birds, of machine guns jamming in the dust, and of emus scattering with almost comic precision. Headlines alternated between incredulity and amusement. Australian army outwitted by birds. Feathered generals defeat troops. Emus win again. Cartoonists seized on the story, portraying emus in military attire, laughing at humans who had underestimated them. These depictions were not just humorous, they were emblematic, capturing the absurdity, frustration, and sheer improbability of the conflict. Public perception was divided. Many Australians found the events hilarious, delighting in the notion that the emus had bested the army. Letters poured into newspapers, with citizens offering advice, jokes, and sympathetic commentary for the beleaguered soldiers. At the same time, farmers who had endured the real consequences of lost crops and destroyed fences experienced a more nuanced response. A mixture of exasperation, resignation, and reluctant admiration for the birds' resilience. The conflict became a touchstone for conversations about the unpredictability of life and the limits of human control. Internationally, the Great Emu War captured imaginations. Reports in Europe and North America highlighted the story as a quirky yet instructive example of human overconfidence. Foreign newspapers often treated it as a humorous oddity, a bizarre headline illustrating the unpredictability of human affairs when confronted with nature. Cartoons, opinion pieces, and commentary pieces depicted emus as near mythical adversaries, further cementing their reputation as clever, almost anthropomorphic creatures capable of outsmarting humans at every turn. The media frenzy extended beyond print. Radio broadcasts discussed the war with incredulity, while public lectures used it as a case study in mismanagement and the limits of conventional military strategy. Scholars and journalists alike debated the implications. How had trained soldiers failed against birds? Was this evidence of human hubris? Or was it simply an unavoidable lesson about respecting ecological systems and acknowledging the intelligence inherent in natural adaptation? The story's appeal lay not only in its absurdity, but in its ability to communicate these larger truths with clarity and impact. Politicians were not immune to the influence of public perception. Some used the story to criticize military decision-making, arguing that the deployment of soldiers against emus had been a waste of resources. Others defended the efforts, emphasizing that the government had acted in good faith to protect farmers' livelihoods and national wheat production. These debates highlighted broader tensions in governance, the balance between immediate intervention and long-term solutions, the limits of authority when faced with ecological challenges, and the potential consequences of misjudging natural forces. The Australian public's fascination with the emus persisted for decades. Folklore, songs, and local storytelling immortalized the bird's triumph. The term emu war itself became shorthand for improbable defeats, particularly those in which human expectation collides with an unpredictable natural or social force. Children learned the story in school. Families recounted it over dinners, and it became an enduring symbol of both humor and humility. Beyond entertainment, it served as a reminder that adaptability, patience, and observation are often more valuable than brute force or rigid planning. Even within military circles, the Emu War remained a cautionary tale. Officers studied the campaign to understand how superior technology and manpower could fail against unconventional challenges. It was used to teach lessons in flexibility, the importance of intelligence gathering, and the need to anticipate unexpected variables in planning operations. The war's outcomes highlighted that human expectations often fail when confronted with systems, whether natural or social, that operate according to their own rules. Ultimately, the media coverage and public reaction amplified the story's cultural resonance. The Emu War was no longer just a series of failed military campaigns. It had become a symbol of human limitation, environmental adaptation, and the humorous absurdity that can arise when expectations clash with reality. Emus were immortalized as clever, resilient, and unexpectedly formidable, reminding both Australians and the wider world that nature has its own agency, and that human efforts to dominate it are often met with surprising resistance.
The Great Emu War did more than provide a comedic anecdote for newspapers and international audiences. Its consequences rippled through Australian agriculture and ecological management for decades. Farmers quickly realized that military intervention had been ineffective and costly, prompting a reevaluation of how humans interacted with wildlife in agricultural zones. Crop losses had exposed vulnerabilities in farming practices, highlighting the need for strategies that accounted for both natural behavior and environmental realities. What emerged was a new era of adaptive management, born not from triumph, but from failure. Fence design became one of the most immediate and tangible innovations. Simple wire fences were often inadequate, allowing emus to push through or jump over. Farmers experimented with double-layered fencing, reinforced posts, and angled barriers designed to exploit the birds' natural behaviors. By understanding how emus moved and foraged, these early innovators developed more resilient and effective methods to protect crops. The lessons learned in the wake of the war informed future agricultural infrastructure across Australia, setting standards for livestock and crop protection that balanced human needs with ecological realities. Crop management itself also underwent transformation. Farmers began to diversify the grains they planted, introducing varieties less attractive to emus or spacing crops to reduce the impact of flock movements. Buffer zones and rotational planting strategies allowed for partial protection without requiring constant human supervision. In essence, the failure of the military campaign forced the farming community to adopt a holistic approach. Rather than trying to remove the problem entirely, they learned to coexist with it, mitigating damage while preserving their livelihoods. The war also spurred interest in population monitoring and wildlife management. Scientists and agricultural advisors were called in to study emu migration patterns, feeding habits, and reproductive cycles. These observations informed both immediate solutions and long-term policies for managing large bird populations in Australia's wheat-growing regions. The Emu War became a case study in human-wildlife conflict, illustrating how ecological understanding could prevent economic loss and how ignorance could amplify it. This knowledge would later influence pest control and conservation strategies across the country, demonstrating the importance of learning from failure rather than relying solely on force. Beyond technical solutions, the Emu War also shaped cultural attitudes toward wildlife. The story fostered respect for the resilience and adaptability of the natural world. Farmers and citizens alike recognized that emus were not mere pests, but intelligent, persistent creatures capable of navigating human interventions. This respect extended to broader ecological awareness, influencing how communities approached other challenges posed by animals, drought, and environmental pressures. The war highlighted that coexistence, observation, and adaptation were often more sustainable than domination or eradication. Economically, the Emu War forced a reconsideration of risk management. Crop insurance, contingency planning, and cooperative strategies among farmers became more prominent. Communities shared knowledge about flock movements and effective deterrence, creating informal networks of information and support. This collective approach reduced vulnerability and built resilience, turning individual failures into a communal learning experience. In many ways, the emus had inadvertently catalyzed innovation and cooperation among humans, a quiet victory that extended far beyond the battlefields of wheat fields. On a larger scale, the Emu War also contributed to international understanding of human-wildlife conflicts. Reports and studies circulated globally, offering a unique case in which technology, manpower, and strategy were insufficient against ecological forces. Scholars and agriculturalists studied the incident, drawing lessons about adaptability,
planning, and respect for environmental complexity. The war demonstrated that conventional approaches to problem solving might fail when confronted with natural systems, highlighting the importance of interdisciplinary thinking in both agriculture and conservation. The ecological impact of the emus themselves was also notable. By moving through farmland, they redistributed seeds, fertilized soil, and influenced vegetation patterns. While destructive in the short term, their movements contributed to the broader dynamics of the Australian landscape, reminding humans that all interventions have consequences, and that survival in the natural world is rarely one-dimensional. The emus, in their quiet persistence, reshaped both the physical and cultural landscape, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the absurdity of bullets and failed ambushes. The Great Emu War, therefore, was both a cautionary tale and an inadvertent catalyst for innovation. It reshaped agricultural practices, inspired cultural reflection, and provided enduring lessons about the limits of human control, the power of adaptation, and the resilience of nature. In confronting the emus, humans learned not only humility, but also ingenuity, a dual legacy that continues to resonate across the Australian outback and beyond.
The Great Emu War did not fade into obscurity after the bullets stopped flying and the farmers adapted. On the contrary, it evolved into a cultural touchstone, a story retold across generations with equal parts humor, awe, and reflection. Australians quickly realized that the absurdity of trained soldiers being outmaneuvered by birds was too compelling to forget. The war entered the nation's collective memory, celebrated in folklore, literature, music, and eventually digital media, ensuring that the emu's triumph remained both legendary and instructive. Local folklore began immediately after the war. Farmers and townspeople told stories of the feathered generals who led the emus to victory, emphasizing the birds' cunning and speed. Tales were often exaggerated, describing emus evading machine guns with near supernatural agility, coordinating movements across vast plains, and even seeming to mock their human adversaries. Children grew up hearing these stories, often passed down by grandparents who had witnessed the chaos firsthand. These narratives reinforced a sense of respect and humor, blending the extraordinary with the everyday experiences of rural life. Artists and writers embraced the Great Emu War as a source of inspiration. Political cartoons captured soldiers crouching behind dust clouds, Lewis guns aimed futilely at fleeing birds. Short stories and newspaper columns depicted emus as clever, almost anthropomorphic creatures capable of outsmarting humans through sheer instinct and determination. Poets and humorists alike found the story irresistible, blending commentary on human overconfidence with playful imagination. Over time, the emus became cultural icons, a symbol of Australia's wilderness, resilience, and capacity for surprises that defy expectation. Music and performance celebrated the event as well. Folk songs told of emus racing across wheat fields, the laughter of birds echoing over the plains, and the bewilderment of soldiers who had trained for war but found themselves outwitted by nature. These songs, performed in local pubs and community gatherings, reinforced both the narrative of the bird's triumph and the enduring humor of the event. The Great Emu was thus transcended mere historical record, embedding itself in daily life and memory through storytelling, performance, and art. Internationally, the story maintained a presence as an amusing yet instructive example of human miscalculation. Academics referenced it in lectures about strategy, environmental management, and human-wildlife conflict. Military historians occasionally cited it as a cautionary tale about overconfidence and inflexible planning. Beyond scholarly circles, it appeared in popular media, books, and even digital platforms, attracting new generations of audiences fascinated by the unlikely victory of birds over humans. Its comedic and cautionary elements made it uniquely adaptable to various forms of interpretation, ensuring its relevance across decades.
The Emu War also influenced public perception of Australia's environment and wildlife. The story emphasized the vastness, unpredictability, and ecological complexity of the outback. Emus became emblematic of the challenges inherent in managing a landscape that humans cannot easily dominate. Conservationists and ecologists often reference the event as an early humorous illustration of the difficulties of human-wildlife interaction. A vivid example of how resilience and adaptation in nature can confront and sometimes outlast human ambition. Even in modern times, the story persists in popular culture. Internet memes, history podcasts, and trivia books keep the tale alive, ensuring that the image of emus outrunning machine guns remains iconic. Educational programs for children highlight it as a lesson in ecological awareness, adaptation, and the limits of human power. The story resonates because it combines humor, history, and practical insight, appealing simultaneously to those who appreciate absurdity and those who seek deeper lessons about nature and strategy. The cultural legacy is also reflective. The Great Emu War reminds humans to approach the natural world with humility. The birds, unconcerned with human pride or planning, achieved what many considered impossible. Their victory was not deliberate, but instinctual, a testament to the power of evolutionary adaptation and environmental mastery. In celebrating their legacy, Australians and the wider world are reminded of the necessity to respect nature, to adapt rather than dominate, and to recognize the limits of human authority when confronted with systems beyond full comprehension. Through storytelling, media, art, and education, the Great Emu War has achieved a form of immortality. The emus, silent and persistent, became symbols of resilience, adaptability, and the unpredictable outcomes of human interference. The event is both comedic and instructive, absurd yet deeply revealing of the human condition. In essence, the Emu War is a narrative that transcends time, offering laughter, insight, and a powerful reminder of nature's quiet supremacy, a lesson as vital today as it was in the wheat fields of 1932.
Looking back from nearly a century later, the Great Emu War remains one of history's strangest conflicts, an event that defies conventional understanding of warfare, strategy, and human ambition. What started as a desperate attempt to protect crops became an enduring story of absurdity, resilience, and unexpected outcomes. Soldiers, farmers, journalists, and emus all played roles in a saga that was simultaneously comical and instructive. Yet beyond the humor lies a wealth of lessons, spanning environmental management, human psychology, and the delicate balance between ambition and humility. For the military, the Emu War was a humbling experience. Trained for precision, strategy, and coordination, soldiers confronted an adversary they could neither predict nor control. The birds' movements, seemingly chaotic but perfectly adapted to their environment, rendered machine guns and military tactics almost useless. Reports from the field describe exhaustion, frustration, and incredulity. Officers were forced to adapt in real time, only to find that their methods were largely ineffective. The psychological dimension of the conflict cannot be understated. Humans were accustomed to dominating their surroundings, yet here they faced an opponent with no intent to fight, yet remarkable ability to evade. The lesson was stark. Intelligence, training, and technology have limits when applied against forces that operate on entirely different principles. Farmers learned similar lessons in resilience, creativity, and adaptability. The withdrawal of the military meant that local communities had to manage their own defense, forcing a combination of innovation, cooperation, and patience. Fences were redesigned, crops were strategically placed, and communal networks were created to share information about flock movements. In essence, the emos compelled humans to engage in problem-solving grounded in observation and adaptation rather than brute force. The war illuminated the value of flexibility, local knowledge, and ecological awareness.
concepts that would influence agricultural policy and land management for decades. Environmental and ecological perspectives gained renewed attention in the wake of the war. Scientists and policymakers began to recognize the importance of coexistence and adaptation when managing wildlife. The emus were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were creatures acting according to instinct and evolutionary design. Their survival strategies, migratory patterns, rapid dispersal, and social cohesion allowed them to thrive despite human interference. This observation became a foundational lesson for wildlife management, illustrating that understanding the behavior of a species is often more effective than attempting to eradicate it. Culturally, the Emu War achieved near mythical status. Its retelling blends humor, history, and moral reflection, ensuring that the story persists across generations. Australians remember the event as a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the unpredictable challenges of life in the outback. International audiences continue to reference it as a remarkable example of human overconfidence confronted by nature. Cartoons, songs, podcasts, and internet media perpetuate the story, emphasizing both its comedic absurdity and its instructive value. The emus themselves, silent yet triumphant, became icons, embodiments of adaptability, persistence, and ecological intelligence. Looking back from nearly a century later, the Great Emu War remains one of history's strangest conflicts, an event that defies conventional understanding of warfare, strategy, and human ambition. What began as a desperate attempt to protect wheat crops became an enduring story of humility, resilience, adaptation, and unexpected outcomes. Soldiers, farmers, journalists, and emus all played roles in a saga that was simultaneously comical and instructive. Yet, beyond the humor lies a wealth of lessons spanning environmental management, human psychology, and the delicate balance between ambition and humility. For the soldiers involved, the war was a humbling experience. Trained for precision, strategy, and coordination, they confronted an adversary they could neither predict nor control. Field reports describe exhaustion, frustration, and incredulity. Officers had to adapt in real time, only to find that conventional military methods were largely ineffective. Many soldiers later recalled the absurdity of chasing birds across wide wheat fields under the scorching sun while their weapons jammed or misfired. The psychological strain was considerable. Here were humans, confident in their authority, outmaneuvered by creatures guided purely by instinct and survival. Farmers faced the immediate consequences of the conflict in equally tangible ways. Crops were decimated, fences toppled, and the cost of lost wheat was substantial, especially during the hardships of the Great Depression. In response, communities adopted innovative approaches to agricultural management. Double-layered fencing, rotational crops, buffer zones, and early warning observation networks became common. Families worked together, sharing knowledge about emu behavior, tracking flock movements, and devising strategies to minimize losses. These adaptations, born of necessity, represent a profound shift from confrontation to coexistence, highlighting lessons in resilience, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving. The emus themselves offer a remarkable study in adaptation. Their speed, agility, and flock dynamics created an almost strategic resistance to human intervention. Birds could spot distant threats, scatter unpredictably, and regroup efficiently, confounding attempts at attainment. Their migration patterns ensured access to plentiful food resources while minimizing human interference. In essence, the emus demonstrated the power of instinctive intelligence, adaptability, and environmental mastery, reminding humans that success is not always determined by force or planning, but often by subtle, persistent resilience. cultural reflection further cements the war's legacy. Across Australia, the story became folklore, told in local gatherings, schools, and pubs. Songs celebrated the emu's agility, cartoons lampooned the soldiers, and children learned the tale as both humorous anecdote and moral lesson. Internationally, the story circulated widely, appearing in newspapers, lectures, and eventually digital media. It became a symbol of human overconfidence confronted by nature's unpredictability, a narrative that combines humor, history, and timeless wisdom. In modern ecological and agricultural discourse, the Emu War is cited as a case study in human-wildlife conflict and adaptive management. Scientists analyze emu behavior, flock dynamics, and migratory patterns to inform population control, habitat management, and conservation strategies. Farmers and policymakers use the war as a reminder that intervention without understanding the system is often futile. The lesson is enduring. Observation, patience, and adaptation frequently achieve what dominance cannot. Perhaps most profoundly, the Emu War illustrates the limits of human authority. The soldier's failure, the farmer's adaptations, and the emu's triumph underscore the necessity of humility. Humans, despite firepower, planning, and confidence, were forced to reconsider assumptions, embrace flexibility, and recognize the intelligence inherent in natural systems. The emu's victory was not conscious or malicious, but it reshaped behavior, policy, and culture. In their quiet persistence lies an enduring metaphor for life. Resilience, adaptability, and instinct often outlast arrogance, rigidity, and brute force. Beyond policy and ecology, the war resonates in human psychology and storytelling. It teaches humor in adversity, humility in the face of unpredictability, and creativity when traditional solutions fail. Soldiers, farmers, and observers all became part of a narrative larger than themselves, one that continues to be retold with fascination and amusement. The absurdity of machine guns failing against flightless birds captures attention, but it is the deeper lessons about patience, observation, and the unpredictability of life that give the story weight and relevance across generations.
And so we arrive at the final reflection, Night Thinkers, not with the triumphant cheer of human victory or the finality of a signed treaty, but with something far subtler, far more profound. Reflection. The Great Emu War may have begun as a desperate attempt to protect wheat crops, a military operation against a flock of birds, but what it became is something far larger. It became a story of humility, resilience, adaptation, and the unpredictable beauty of nature. The emus, unassuming, silent, and instinct-driven, taught humans lessons that no manual, no drill, no amount of planning could impart. They did not act with intent or malice, but their persistence, speed, and environmental mastery carved a path through human assumptions and left a mark that resonates even today. Imagine it, the vast, dusty wheat fields of Western Australia in 1932. Sun beating down, the wind carrying the faint scent of grain, and hundreds, no, thousands of emus scattering across the plains, weaving unpredictably through tall stalks. Soldiers crouched behind trucks, Lewis guns trained, fingers on triggers, yet every shot met the unyielding rhythm of instinct and natural agility. The birds did not fear the humans, they did not plan a strategy in a conscious sense, and yet, in the end, they triumphed. Humans, equipped with firepower and formal training, retreated. They were outmaneuvered, outlasted, and ultimately humbled by creatures that required nothing more than patience, observation, and the natural intelligence to survive. This, Night Thinkers, is the heart of the story.
The humor, yes, it is undeniable. Cartoons of soldiers chasing emus, headlines proclaiming the army's defeat, and anecdotes that have been passed down for generations all make us laugh. But laughter only scratches the surface. Beneath the absurdity lies the enduring truth that human ambition, no matter how confident or well-resourced, is not absolute. Nature operates on rules we often cannot perceive fully, and resilience, adaptability, and instinct can rival and surpass deliberate planning. The farmers who faced the immediate consequences of this peculiar conflict learned lessons that extended far beyond any joke or story. Fences were redesigned, crops were strategically planned, and communities developed informal networks to track emu movements and mitigate damage. These innovations, born of necessity, represent a profound shift from confrontation to coexistence, highlighting lessons in resilience, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving. Culturally, the Emu War achieved immortality. Songs, folk tales, cartoons, and more recently, podcasts and digital media have preserved its story across generations. Australians remember the event as a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the unpredictable challenges of life in the outback. International audiences continue to reference it as a remarkable example of human overconfidence confronted by nature. The emus themselves, silent yet triumphant, became icons, embodiments of adaptability, persistence, and ecological intelligence. And here's the quiet, final lesson. The emus did not act out of malice, nor did they consciously defeat anyone. They simply existed, adapted, moved, and survived. Yet their persistence reshaped landscapes, influenced policy, and captured imaginations across the globe. In that, there is a profound lesson for all of us. Sometimes the most impactful victories are not the ones we fight for with force or strategy, but the ones achieved through quiet resilience, environmental harmony, and the timeless persistence to simply keep moving forward. The Great Emu War, as absurd as it may seem, leaves behind a legacy that endures. A tale of unexpected triumph, ecological intelligence, human perseverance, and humility before forces that cannot be fully controlled. It is a story of laughter and reflection, of failure and adaptation, and above all, of the lessons humans can learn when they pause to observe, respect, and adapt to the world around them.